Poor rancher married fat stranger for a cow. On wedding night, she locked the door. Ezra Hawkins had exactly 3 things left in the world: a broken-down cabin, a stubborn mule named Chester, and pride so thin it wouldn't keep a sparrow warm. What he didn't have was a single cow, which in cattle country made him about as useful as a chocolate teapot. That's why, when the peculiar advertisement appeared in the Millerville Herald, Ezra read it 3 times to make sure his empty stomach wasn't making him see things. Seeking husband. Large woman of independent means requires marriage for legal purposes. Will provide substantial livestock in exchange for ceremony. No questions asked. Serious inquiries only. Contact Widow Abernathy, Millerville Hotel. Ezra stared at the newspaper until the words blurred. A wife he didn't particularly need, livestock he desperately did. It seemed like a straightforward business transaction, the kind that kept body and soul together when pride became a luxury a man couldn't afford. The next morning, he rode Chester the 12 miles to Millerville, wearing his only clean shirt and the kind of determination that comes from having no other options. The widow Abernathy was waiting in the hotel lobby, and Ezra's first thought was that the word large had been a considerable understatement. She was a woman of magnificent proportions, probably 40 years old, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and eyes that suggested she'd seen enough of the world to be thoroughly unimpressed by most of it. "You the fellow responding to my advertisement?" she asked without preamble. "Yes, ma'am." Ezra Hawkins. He removed his hat, suddenly aware of how shabby he must look. She studied him like she was evaluating livestock at auction. "You desperate enough to marry a stranger for cattle?" "I reckon I am." "Good. Desperation means you won't ask foolish questions or develop romantic notions." She stood, her considerable bulk managing to convey authority rather than mere size. "I'm Margaret Abernathy. I need a husband for legal reasons I won't be explaining. In exchange, you'll receive 20 head of prime beef cattle and a bull that'll improve your bloodline considerably." Ezra's mouth went dry. 20 head was more wealth than he'd ever imagined possessing. "What's the catch?" Smart question. Margaret's lips quirked in what might have been approval. "No catch, exactly, just conditions. We marry today. You get your cattle tomorrow. After that, we live as we see fit with no interference from either party. Live as we see fit. You keep to your business, I keep to mine. Marriage is just paper between us, nothing more." It sounded too good to be true, which in Ezra's experience usually meant it was, but 20 head of cattle represented the difference between slow starvation and actual prosperity. "All right," he said. "Let's get married." The ceremony took place an hour later at the courthouse, witnessed by 2 clerks who looked like they'd seen stranger things that week. Margaret had changed into a dark blue dress that was well made but practical, and she spoke her vows with the same tone she might use to order supplies. Ezra found himself studying his new wife as the justice of the peace droned through the familiar words. She wasn't pretty in any conventional sense, but there was something about her bearing that commanded respect. She stood like a woman who'd fought battles and won most of them. "You may kiss the bride," the justice announced. Margaret extended her hand for a businesslike handshake instead. "Congratulations, Mr. Hawkins. You're now the owner of 20 head of cattle. Congratulations, Mrs. Hawkins. You're now legally married to a man you met an hour ago." "Mrs. Abernathy," she corrected firmly. "I'm keeping my name." After the ceremony, Margaret led him to a wagon loaded with supplies. "Wedding present," she said. Figured you'd need provisions to go with the cattle. Ezra looked at the bacon, flour, coffee, and other luxuries he hadn't seen in months. This is mighty generous. It's practical. Can't have my husband starving to death before the marriage serves its purpose. They rode back toward Ezra's homestead in companionable silence, the loaded wagon creaking along the rutted road. As the sun began to set, Ezra realized he'd never asked the obvious question. "Mrs. Abernathy, what exactly are these legal reasons you needed a husband for?" Margaret was quiet for so long that Ezra thought she might not answer. Then she sighed, a sound that carried more weight than her considerable frame. "My late husband left his property to me, but only if I remain married. If I'm widowed for more than 6 months, everything goes to his worthless nephew in St. Louis. The 6 months are up next week." "So you needed a husband to keep your inheritance." "I needed a husband who wouldn't expect a real marriage." "Someone desperate enough to take the deal without demanding conjugal rights or trying to control my affairs." Ezra felt heat rise in his face. He hadn't even considered that aspect of marriage. In his mind, this was purely a business arrangement. "I wouldn't presume," he started. "Good, because I've been married once to a man who presumed quite a bit. I won't be doing that again." There was steel in her voice that suggested a story Ezra probably didn't want to hear. They finished the ride in silence. As they approached Ezra's modest homestead, Margaret looked around with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating property. "Needs work," she observed. "Everything needs work when you can't afford to fix it properly." "Well, now you can afford it." She climbed down from the wagon with surprising grace for her size. "Where am I sleeping tonight?" The question caught Ezra off guard. He'd been so focused on the cattle and the legal aspects that he hadn't considered the practical arrangements. There's only the one room in the cabin. I can sleep in the barn." "Don't be ridiculous. It's my wedding night, even if it's not a real marriage. I'll take the cabin." "But it's my cabin." Margaret fixed him with a look that could have frozen fire. "Mr. Hawkins, I just gave you 20 head of cattle and enough supplies to last 3 months. I think I've earned the right to sleep in a bed for one night." She had a point. Ezra gathered some blankets and headed for the barn, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. An hour later, as he lay on a pile of hay listening to Chester snore, Ezra heard something that made him sit up, voices from the direction of the cabin, men's voices, and they didn't sound friendly. He crept to the barn door and peered out. 3 riders had approached the cabin, and even in the moonlight, Ezra could see they were armed. One of them was pounding on the door. "Open up, you cow! We know you're in there!" Ezra's blood went cold. These men knew Margaret, and they definitely weren't here for social call. "Margaret Abernathy!" another voice called. "You can't hide forever." "Uncle Charlie wants his money." Through the cabin window, Ezra could see Margaret moving around inside, but she didn't answer the door. Smart woman. 3 armed men in the dark usually didn't bring good news. "She ain't coming out, Jake," one of the men said. "Maybe she ain't here." "She's here. Widow Pritchard saw her ride out with some local farmer, probably hiding behind his skirts now." Ezra felt anger flare in his chest. He didn't know what this was about, but he knew bullying when he saw it, and nobody was going to terrorize his wife on their wedding night, business arrangement or not. He grabbed his rifle from the barn and stepped into the moonlight. "You boys seem to be lost," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. The 3 men spun toward him, hands moving toward their guns. In the moonlight, Ezra could see they were rough customers, the kind of men who solved problems with violence and asked questions later. "This ain't your business, farmer," the one called Jake said. "We got business with the woman." "That woman is my wife," Ezra replied, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "That makes it my business." "Your wife?" Jake laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "You married that fat cow." "What did she offer you? All the beef you could eat?" The insult hit Ezra harder than he expected. Margaret might not be conventional, but she'd shown him more kindness in one day than he'd received in months. "I'm going to ask you boys to leave," Ezra said, raising his rifle slightly, politely. "3 of us, 1 of you," another man pointed out. "Are you sure you want to play those odds?" "Pretty sure I don't want to explain to the sheriff tomorrow why 3 armed men were threatening my wife in the middle of the night." Before anyone could respond, the cabin door opened and Margaret stepped out. In the moonlight, she looked formidable rather than fat, a woman who'd faced down trouble before and wasn't intimidated by it now. "Jake Morrison," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. I might have known Charlie would send his pet weasel to do his dirty work. Uncle Charlie wants what you owe him, Margaret, with interest. I don't owe Charlie Morrison anything except maybe a kick in the teeth. You borrowed $500 3 years ago. Time to pay up." Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. That 500 was payment for putting up with his brother's fists for 10 years. "Charlie's lucky I don't charge him interest for the bruises." Ezra felt pieces clicking together. Margaret's first husband had been abusive, and now his family was trying to collect some kind of debt. The whole situation made his stomach turn. "The way I hear it," Margaret continued, "Charlie's been telling folks I owe him money so he can justify taking my land when his nephew inherits." "Neat little plan, except for one problem." "What's that?" Margaret gestured toward Ezra. "I'm not a widow anymore. I'm married to a man with a rifle and a very short temper when it comes to people threatening his wife." Jake looked between Margaret and Ezra, clearly trying to calculate his odds. "This ain't over, Margaret." "Yes, it is," she replied firmly. "I'm married now, which means Charlie's nephew gets nothing." "And if you or Charlie or anyone else comes around here making threats, my husband will be happy to discuss it with the business end of his Winchester." The 3 men mounted their horses, but Jake couldn't resist one final threat. "Enjoy your new husband while you can, Margaret. Accidents happen to farmers all the time." After they rode away, Ezra and Margaret stood in the yard, both breathing heavily from the confrontation. "I'm sorry about that," Margaret said finally. "I didn't think Charlie would move this fast." "Who's Charlie Morrison?" "My late husband's brother. He's been trying to get his hands on my land for months, claiming I owe money I never borrowed." She looked at Ezra with something that might have been gratitude. "You didn't have to step in like that." "Like hell I didn't." "Nobody threatens my wife. Your business partner," Margaret corrected, but her voice was softer than before. "My wife," Ezra insisted. "We said vows, remember? That means something, even if it started as business." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You realize this probably won't be the last visit from Charlie's boys. Then I guess we'll deal with them together." Something shifted in Margaret's expression. You might not get your cattle if Charlie makes too much trouble. Are you sure you want to stick with this arrangement?" Ezra looked at this woman who'd given him a chance at prosperity and was now apologizing for putting him in danger. She was standing straighter despite being shaken by the confrontation, ready to face whatever came next, with the kind of courage that had nothing to do with physical size. Mrs. Abernathy, he said quietly, I think those cattle are the least important part of this arrangement. What do you mean? I mean a man could do a lot worse than being married to a woman who stands up to 3 armed thugs and worries more about keeping her word than keeping herself safe. Margaret stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. You don't know me, Mr. Hawkins. I'm not the kind of woman men usually want to be married to. Maybe you've been married to the wrong kind of men. The words hung between them in the moonlight. Finally, Margaret cleared her throat. Well, I suppose we should both try to get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. She turned toward the cabin, then stopped. Mr. Hawkins, thank you for what you did tonight. Ezra, he said. And if we're married, you might as well use my first name. Margaret, she replied, and the cabin's big enough for both of us, if you want to sleep inside. Ezra felt something warm unfurl in his chest. I'd like that. They went inside together, Margaret settling on the bed while Ezra made a pallet on the floor. As he lay there listening to her steady breathing, Ezra realized that for the first time in months, he didn't feel alone. He also realized that somewhere between I do and facing down armed men, this had stopped being just a business arrangement. The next morning brought both the promised cattle and more trouble. Margaret was true to her word. 20 head of prime beef cattle arrived with the sunrise, driven by a cowherd who tipped his hat to Margaret with obvious respect. Fine animals, Mrs. Abernathy, the man said. That bull's got bloodlines that'll improve any herd. Thank you, Joseph. Make sure Mr. Hawkins knows how to handle them properly. But even as Ezra marveled at his sudden wealth in livestock, he could see dust clouds on the horizon, more riders approaching, and given yesterday's events, probably not bringing good news. This time it was Charlie Morrison himself, a thin man with mean eyes and the kind of mustache that suggested he thought highly of his own opinions. He brought 6 men with him, enough to make their intentions clear. Margaret, Charlie called out without dismounting, time to discuss your debt like civilized people. Nothing to discuss, Charlie. I don't owe you money, and I'm not a widow anymore. So I heard. Convenient timing. Charlie's gaze shifted to Ezra. You the fool who married her for cattle. I'm the man who married her because she's worth marrying, Ezra replied, surprising himself with his conviction. Charlie laughed. Worth marrying? She's big enough to be worth marrying 3 times over. The insult hit Ezra like a physical blow. Without thinking, he stepped forward. That's my wife you're talking about. Easy there, farmer. No need to get worked up over a business transaction. This isn't a transaction anymore, Margaret touched Ezra's arm gently. Charlie, you've got no claim on me or my land. Find another way to solve your money problems. $500, Margaret, plus 3 years interest. That's $700 total. I never borrowed a penny from you. Your husband did, day before he died, as a matter of fact. Got it in writing. Charlie pulled a paper from his pocket and waved it in the air. Even from a distance, Ezra could see it looked official. That's a lie, Margaret said, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. Witnessed and notarized. Pay up, or I'll take it to the county judge. Ezra felt Margaret sag slightly beside him. $700 might as well have been 7,000 for all the chance they had of raising it. Give me a week, Margaret said quietly. 3 days after that, I start collecting interest in other ways. Charlie's smile was unpleasant. Might start with those nice cattle you just gave away? After Charlie and his men rode off, Margaret sank onto the cabin steps like the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. "It's not true," she said, but she sounded like she was trying to convince herself. Thomas never borrowed money from Charlie. He hated Charlie, but Charlie has papers, forged most likely, but proving that in court. She shook her head. Charlie's got influence in town. Judge Henderson owes him favors. Ezra sat beside her, thinking hard. What if we don't fight it in court? What do you mean? Charlie wants $700. What if we give it to him? Margaret stared at him. Ezra, I don't have $700. That's why I needed to stay married to keep the land, but I've got 20 head of cattle now, worth at least $40 a head. You're not selling your cattle for my problems. Our problems, Ezra corrected, and they're not my cattle anyway. They're our cattle. You don't understand. Even if we paid Charlie, he'd just find another way to cause trouble. Men like him don't give up. Ezra was quiet for a moment. What if Charlie wasn't a problem anymore? What do you mean? I mean, what if Charlie Morrison decided that bothering us was more trouble than it was worth? Margaret looked at him sharply. Ezra Hawkins, if you're thinking about doing something stupid, not stupid, smart, but I'm going to need your help. That evening, Ezra rode into Millerville alone, leaving Margaret at the homestead with strict instructions to stay inside with the rifle handy. He had a plan, but it required careful timing and a considerable amount of luck. He found Charlie Morrison in the saloon, holding court with his cronies and bragging about his clever scheme to get Margaret's land. "Evening, Charlie," Ezra said, approaching the table with the kind of confidence he didn't feel. "Well, if it isn't Margaret's new husband, come to beg for more time." "Come to make you an offer." Charlie's eyebrows rose. "I'm listening. Double or nothing." "What?" Ezra pulled out a leather pouch and set it on the table with a satisfying clink. "I've got $350 here, cash money from selling half my herd today." It was true. Ezra had sold 10 head that afternoon to a buyer passing through, getting top dollar because Margaret's cattle were prime stock. "My offer is this," Ezra continued. "One hand of poker. I win. You tear up that paper and leave my wife alone. You win. You get $350 in cash, plus the balance we supposedly owe you." Charlie's eyes gleamed with greed and amusement. "You're betting against a man who's been playing cards longer than you've been breathing, boy. Maybe, but I'm betting on my wife's word against yours." "She says that paper's a fake. And if she's wrong, then you get your money tonight instead of in 3 days. Charlie looked around the table at his companions, who were all grinning at the idea of watching the farmer get fleeced. "One hand." "Winner takes all. Winner takes all. Deal." What Charlie didn't know was that Ezra had learned to play poker from his grandfather, who taught him that the most important rule wasn't about cards, it was about reading people. And Charlie Morrison was the kind of man who couldn't resist showing off, especially when he thought he had an advantage. The hand was dealt. Charlie drew 3 cards, his face showing just enough satisfaction to tell Ezra he had something decent but not spectacular. Ezra drew 2 cards and kept his expression carefully neutral. "Your bet, farmer?" Ezra pushed the entire pouch into the center of the table. All of it. Charlie hesitated for the first time. A man confident in his hand wouldn't bet everything on one draw. Unless... "You're bluffing," Charlie said. "Only one way to find out." Charlie pushed forward his own money, matching the bet. "Let's see what you've got." Ezra laid down his cards. A pair of kings, nothing more. It was a decent hand, but far from unbeatable. Charlie started to smile as he reached for his own cards. Then his face went white. "What's wrong, Charlie?" one of his friends asked. Charlie's hands were shaking slightly as he stared at his cards. I don't." "Show your cards, Charlie," Ezra said quietly. Charlie laid down his hand, a pair of jacks. A good hand, but not good enough. The saloon erupted in noise as Charlie's cronies realized their leader had just been outplayed by a farmer. But Ezra was watching Charlie's face, and what he saw there wasn't just disappointment. It was fear. "That paper, Charlie," Ezra said, scooping up his winnings. "The one supposedly signed by Margaret's husband. What about it? You're going to tear it up now, in front of everyone." Charlie's hands were definitely shaking now. "I don't have it with me." "Yes, you do. A man like you wouldn't let something that valuable out of his sight." Slowly, reluctantly, Charlie reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded paper. Even across the table, Ezra could see it looked freshly written. "Go ahead, Charlie." "Tear it up. You don't understand. I borrowed money from some bad people to get this land deal together. If I don't deliver—" The admission hung in the air. Charlie Morrison, the big man with the threatening cronies, was just as desperate as everyone else. "Should have thought of that before you tried to steal from my wife," Ezra said. Charlie tore the paper into pieces with shaking hands. The saloon had gone quiet, watching this reversal of fortune with the fascination people always showed for a bully getting his comeuppance. "Charlie," Ezra said as he stood to leave, "if you or any of your boys come around my place again, I'll make sure everyone in this county knows you tried to steal a widow's land with forged papers." "Won't be good for your reputation." Charlie nodded miserably, already calculating how he was going to explain this disaster to his creditors. Ezra rode home through the darkness, the money safely in his saddlebags, and a weight lifted from his shoulders. He'd gambled everything on reading Charlie Morrison correctly, and it had paid off. But more importantly, he'd done it for Margaret. Not for the cattle, not for the business arrangement, but because she was his wife, and nobody was going to cheat her while he had breath in his body. When he reached the homestead, Margaret was waiting on the porch with the rifle across her knees. "Well?" she asked. "Charlie won't be bothering us any more." Ezra dismounted and walked over to her. "And we've got enough money left over to fix up this place properly." "How did you—" She stopped as she saw his expression. "You didn't kill him, did you?" "Nothing so dramatic. Just played poker with him. And won. Your word against his, remember? I bet on you being right about that paper being forged." Margaret stared at him for a long moment. "You risked everything on my word?" "Seemed like a safe bet." She was quiet for so long that Ezra began to worry he'd overstepped somehow. Then she stood and walked over to him. "Ezra Hawkins," she said softly, "I think I'm beginning to understand why you were worth marrying for more than just cattle." "Is that so?" "That's so." She reached up and touched his face gently. "And I think maybe it's time we talked about what kind of marriage we really want to have." Ezra felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. "What did you have in mind?" "Well," Margaret said, "we could keep pretending this is just business. Or we could admit that somewhere between I do and tonight, something real started happening between us. Something real." Something worth more than 20 head of cattle and a legal arrangement. She paused. If you're interested. Ezra looked at this remarkable woman who'd given him prosperity, stood beside him in danger, and trusted him with her deepest troubles. She wasn't conventional by any standard, but she was brave and kind and honest, qualities that seemed a lot more important than anything else. "Margaret Abernathy," he said, "I think I'd like to find out what a real marriage with you might look like. Even though I'm not the kind of woman men usually choose, especially because you're not that kind of woman. I've seen that kind of woman, and they never offered to face down armed thugs or trust me with their life savings." Margaret smiled, the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen from her. "In that case, Mr. Hawkins, perhaps you'd better start calling me by my first name. I thought I was already doing that, Mrs. Hawkins." "Margaret Hawkins," she said, trying out the sound. "I think I like that better than I expected." "Good," Ezra said, "because I was hoping you'd keep it." That night, for the first time since their wedding, they shared the cabin as husband and wife rather than business partners. And Ezra discovered that Margaret had been right about one thing. She definitely wasn't like other women. She was better. 6 months later, the Hawkins Ranch was the most prosperous spread in 3 counties. The cattle had multiplied, the cabin had been expanded into a proper house, and Margaret's business sense had turned their modest operation into a thriving enterprise. But more importantly, Ezra had learned something he'd never expected. Sometimes the best things in life came disguised as desperate measures. He'd married Margaret for cattle and stayed married to her because she was the finest woman he'd ever met. And if people in town still whispered about the poor rancher who'd married a fat stranger for livestock, well, they were just demonstrating their poor judgment, because any fool could see that Ezra Hawkins was the luckiest man in the territory. He'd gotten the cattle, kept the land, and won the heart of a woman worth her considerable weight in gold. But if this tale of unexpected love and practical romance warmed your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the frontier where love comes in all shapes and sizes and the best partnerships start with honest need and grow into something beautiful.